Now, what is amazing about this, and I think this will shock people in around the world, especially those who are able to get this kind of crony contracts, that this is unparalleled. This is the most incredible crony agreement in the entire history. Justice Carpio said it well. He said, this is the biggest presidential gift to a crony in history. Not just in the history of the Philippines, but I would say in the history of the world. There is nothing that comes close to this. It is estimated that this contract will cost the Philippines 138 billion pesos. If Dennis Uy was not a close friend of President Duterte, would we have sued him or filed a criminal complaint against him? Would he be the subject of so much of this attention? That was the question he asked. Well, that was the wrong question. The question really is, if he was not a close friend and crony of President Duterte, would he have received the benefits of this incredibly one-sided contract that he entered into with the support of the Philippine government? If he was Juan de la Cruz, there would be no question. But it's precisely because of his closeness to President Duterte that he received this benefit. Let's examine what we pointed out in our complaint. The law that there are numerous laws, but the Philippines entered into a joint agreement with Exxon, formerly Exxon, the oil companies, with Shell in particular and Chevron, to develop and operate the Malampaya gas fields. This was back in 1997, and that was formalized later on. But the oil that comes from the Malampaya gas fields was the biggest boon to our energy requirements in the Philippines, in the history of the Philippines. It is the only gas field that we operate. It supplies, as they said, 40% of the energy needs of the island of Luzon. Without the oil from the Malampaya gas fields, we would be entirely and completely dependent on foreign oil from the Middle East and other countries, paying an enormous amount of money that would be remitted abroad and not kept in the Philippines. So the Malampaya gas field is of strategic importance because it was necessary to have the technological assistance of those with experience in developing oil fields. The Philippines entered into this partnership with Chevron and Shell, and it was supposed to last until 2024, from about 2020 or 2001 to 2024. Now, the agreement says that if Chevron or Shell would like to sell their interest, that they would first have to offer it to the Philippine government, and that's what the agreement called for. Now, what we learned is that even before the Philippine government approved the sale to another party, not the Philippine government, of course, there were already negotiations and an agreement that was entered into between Chevron and Dennis Uy. Now, what is amazing about this, and I think this will shock people in around the world, especially those who are able to get this kind of crony contracts, that this is unparalleled. This is the most incredible crony agreement in the entire history. Justice Carpio said it well. He said, this is the biggest presidential gift to a crony in history. Not just in the history of the Philippines, but I would say in the history of the world. There is nothing that comes close to this. It is estimated that this contract will cost the Philippines 138 billion pesos. That, if you look at the recent hearings of the Pharmaly scandal, where the Philippine government gave crony contracts for masks and other equipment for this pandemic, 8 billion pesos went to crony contracts. And we were shocked that 8 billion pesos of Philippine money, Philippine taxpayers' money, would be used to promote the self-serving interests of these small companies. Imagine if one company got 138 billion pesos of what should have gone to the Philippines because of this contract. Now, what's incredible, and this we couldn't believe, but it's all factual. The contract was entered into between this entity called UC Malampaya in April of 2019. UC Malampaya was created by Dennis Uy from his company, the Udena company. That contract in April of 2019 was not approved by the Philippine Department of Energy. In fact, Secretary Cusi, in his testimony before the Senate Committee on Energy, said he was not aware that that Udena and Chevron was negotiating this contract. But the law requires that before Chevron can sell its share to any entity, it must first offer it to the Philippine government. Secretary Cusi said it was never offered to the Philippine government, and he said if we had been offered, it was a good investment, and certainly the Philippines should have taken it and exercised its right of first refusal. That's what he testified to. But bear in mind, it was in April. Now, UC Malampaya, the company that negotiated this contract, was not even organized as a corporation formally until September of 2019. That means a non-entity, that is a corporation that was not in existence, was negotiating what would end up being a 138 billion peso boondoggle. Now, when it was incorporated in April of 2019, the capitalization was only $100. $100 was used to capitalize a corporation that would be operating the biggest and the only oil company of the Philippines. It's staggering to the imagination. How could a non-entity that was incorporated 5 months after it entered into a contract? Now, here's what's amazing about the contract. Chevron was selling its interest in the remaining years of its contract to operate the Malampaya gas field, which was 45% interest in the Malampaya project. It was selling it for $565 million. Now, that may seem a lot, but that's actually very small compared to the amount of money that Chevron was receiving every year from the Philippine government, and over the lifespan of its operation. But it's even worse than that, because the $565 million actually includes $170 million that Chevron was to receive for 2019 and 2020. That means even though the contract had not been entered into, even though the Philippine government had not signed it up yet, even though the corporation it was entering into this agreement with was not registered with the Philippines Securities and Exchange Commission, was not a formal corporation, it was giving this company $170 million of what it was to receive. So this $170 million that Chevron was to receive from the Philippine government was given to UC Malampaya as part of the purchase of its interest in the Malampaya gas field. And then we find out through the records, through the testimony at the Philippine Senate, that $370 million were loans from a bank in New Zealand, actually based in Australia, the Bank of New Zealand, and a bank in Singapore. So the loan was composed of the $370 million from these loans from banks, $157 million, which was to be paid by the Philippine government to Chevron, which instead went to UC Malampaya. And then another $33 million was sourced from equity proceeds, which they've not actually sold yet. But so what came out in the Philippine Senate hearing was that UC Malampaya did not pay 1 centavo to purchase the biggest oil field, the only oil field. That's incredible.